The galaxy was vast, and its many civilizations lived their lives, unaware of the storm that was quietly building. In the farthest reaches of the galaxy, on a small, forgotten planet, an alien species was in grave danger. They had never imagined that their peaceful existence would come to an end. But now, their very survival was at risk. Their planet, once a thriving hub of life, had been struck by a deadly threat, one they could not escape. The enemy was ruthless, and no one had been prepared for such a devastating assault. The alien species, with their fragile ships and outdated technology, had no way to fight back. They were facing destruction, their cities falling to the enemy's relentless attack. In a desperate act, the leaders of the alien race decided to send out a signal, an SOS to anyone who might hear it. They knew they couldn't hold out much longer, but they hoped that someone, somewhere, could save them. The SOS signal was weak and faint, but it carried with it the last hope of an entire civilization. The aliens had no idea who might receive it. Their message wasn't specific, nor was it directed at any particular species. They just needed someone, anyone, to hear their cry for help. The signal was broadcast far and wide, across the many stars and systems, reaching deep into the darkness of space. At the other end of the galaxy, the message traveled through the vast emptiness of space until it reached a fleet that had long been forgotten by most of the galaxy. The fleet, however, was not made up of ordinary beings. It was the fleet of the Deathworlders, a race of fierce warriors known for their brutality and unyielding power. They were a species so feared that most galaxies avoided even speaking their name. The Deathworlders had earned their reputation by being the ultimate predators of the galaxy, conquering and defeating anything that stood in their way. The signal reached them, but they weren't the ones to ignore it. The Deathworlders' fleet, having long since grown accustomed to the quiet of space, suddenly came to life. As the SOS message filtered through their communication systems, their commanders sat in silence. They didn't ask why the message had arrived or what it meant. They understood one thing clearly: the galaxy was vast, and everything in it was either a threat or a tool. This message would be their next move. The fleet, which had been dormant for years, now sparked into action. Each ship was a weapon of war, and its crew, the most skilled and ruthless warriors in the galaxy, were eager to respond. The Deathworlders did not take kindly to weakness, but they were always quick to act when something piqued their interest. And this signal, a desperate plea from an alien race, had done just that. The commanders aboard the fleet's flagship studied the transmission closely. The aliens' message was filled with fear, desperation, and hopelessness. They spoke of their enemies, their cities burning, and their people dying. They begged for help but made no demands or promises. The message was simple: we need help. Please, help us. The Deathworlders, however, were not interested in simply helping. They never offered aid without a reason. They had come to understand that strength and fear ruled the galaxy, and whoever controlled the strongest forces held the power to decide the future. So the question on the minds of the Deathworlders wasn't whether to help these aliens, it was whether to use them. The fleet's commanders gathered in the war room, discussing their options. The alien race, while in a vulnerable state, could offer them much. The Deathworlders were always on the lookout for new ways to expand their influence, and this was an opportunity they couldn't ignore. This SOS signal had the potential to be more than just a cry for help. It could be the first step toward greater power. Without hesitation, the fleet began its journey toward the distant planet. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but that was the Deathworlders' specialty. They were not afraid of challenges. They thrived in chaos. Their ships cut through space like predators hunting their prey. The alien species that had sent the distress signal had no idea what they were about to unleash upon themselves. Meanwhile, back on the alien planet, things were growing worse. The enemy's attacks had become more frequent and more violent. The once peaceful skies were now filled with smoke and ash, and the people were beginning to lose hope. They knew their time was running out, but the flicker of hope that the SOS signal might be heard kept them going. They didn't know who would come or how long it would take, but they clung to the belief that someone, somewhere, would answer their call. The alien leaders huddled in underground bunkers, nervously waiting for any sign of help. The time for evacuation was quickly running out, but their focus was on the signal they had sent out. They hoped it would reach someone who could end their suffering. Little did they know, the response would not come from the gentle hands of a savior, but from the cold, calculating force of the most feared warriors in the galaxy. As the Deathworlder fleet drew closer, the tension on both sides grew thicker. The alien species held their breath, waiting for salvation, while the Deathworlders prepared for what would come next. They had received the signal, but their reasons for answering it were far from what the aliens had imagined. What they did next would change the course of history forever. The vast emptiness of space stretched out before the Deathworlder fleet as it continued its journey toward the alien planet. The ships, sleek and deadly, cut through the void with a sense of purpose. Each ship in the fleet was a masterpiece of war, bristling with advanced weaponry, and covered in armor that could withstand the most devastating attacks. The Deathworlders had no intention of simply arriving and offering help. They had their own plans, and the alien distress signal was merely the beginning. On the flagship, the fleet's commander stood in front of a holographic map of the galaxy, the glowing blue lines representing their path to the distant planet. The commander, a seasoned warrior known for his ruthlessness, studied the map carefully. His name was Varric, and he had been through countless battles, leading his people through wars and conquests across the stars. He understood the nature of power and the importance of striking when the time was right. The signal had called to him not because of a sense of compassion, but because it presented an opportunity to gain something more, a foothold in a new territory, new resources, and perhaps even new allies. Varric's eyes narrowed as he considered the possibilities. The alien race was clearly weak, desperate, and vulnerable. This was not a situation that would be handled with kindness. The Deathworlders never offered charity. In their world, strength was everything, and survival was earned through power. The aliens, in their desperation, had unknowingly placed themselves at the mercy of the most dangerous force in the galaxy. As the fleet continued its journey, Varric ordered the ship's communications officer to analyze the alien signal once more. It was important to gather every piece of information they could. The signal had been weak, fragmented, but it had carried enough for them to know that these aliens were facing an existential threat. Their enemies, whoever they were relentless in their attacks. This presented a problem for the Deathworlders. If they intervened, there would be no guarantee of what would happen once the enemy was defeated. The Deathworlders never got involved unless it served their purpose, and Varric wasn't about to change that now. The ship's communications officer, a sharp-minded individual named Tessa, brought up the transmission on the main screen. The image was flickering, but the words were clear enough. The aliens had begged for help, describing how their cities were being destroyed, their population slaughtered. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pique Varric's interest. There was one thing, however, that stood out to him: the tone of the message. The alien species had been completely unprepared for war. They were not a violent species, nor had they ever encountered such savagery. This, in itself, made the situation even more intriguing. The Deathworlders thrived on conflict, but they also understood that not every battle was worth fighting. This one, however, was different. It had the potential to either lead to a quick victory or offer a way to exploit the alien race for their own gain. Varric turned to his crew, his voice cold and commanding. "Prepare for an arrival like no other. We will offer them our help, but in the end, we will decide their fate." The crew responded with silent nods, understanding the gravity of the situation. The Deathworlders had their own rules, and their code of honor was far removed from the idea of mercy or aid. To them, help meant something entirely different. It meant taking control, asserting dominance, and reshaping the galaxy in their image. Back on the alien planet, the situation continued to deteriorate. The once thriving cities that dotted the surface of the planet were now nothing more than smoldering ruins. The alien leaders, still clinging to hope, gathered in secret chambers beneath the ground. They had done everything they could to prepare their people, but it was clear that the end was near. They had sent the distress signal, but they had no idea if anyone would actually answer. Desperation had pushed them to take this final step. It was their last hope. The Council of Leaders was in disarray. Some believed they should prepare for their inevitable fall and try to evacuate the remaining survivors, while others clung to the belief that someone would come to save them. But no one could have predicted what would come next. As the alien leaders gathered to discuss their next move, the ground shook. The deep rumble echoed through the underground chambers, sending a chill through their bones. A distant hum filled the air, and they knew what it meant. The Deathworlders had arrived. The first of the Deathworlder ships broke through the atmosphere like a falling star, descending into the chaos of the planet below. The ground trembled as the fleet made its landing, their massive ships towering over the alien structures. The sheer size of the Deathworlders' vessels was enough to intimidate any species. To the aliens who had never seen such advanced technology, it was a sight that filled them with dread. The Deathworlders did not come in peace. Their ships opened, and out marched their warriors, fierce, battle-hardened beings, clad in armor that was as terrifying as it was impenetrable. They moved with a calculated precision, their footsteps shaking the ground beneath them. The alien leaders watched in silence, unsure of what would happen next. Would the Deathworlders destroy them? Would they take their planet as their own? The answer, as always, was more complicated. The Deathworlders had come for something far more valuable than destruction. They had come to assess, to conquer, and to claim. This was not just a rescue mission. It was the beginning of a new chapter for the Deathworlders, a chapter that would leave the galaxy forever changed. As the Deathworlders began to make their move, the alien leaders had only one thought on their minds. They had made a deal with the devil. They had begged for help, but they had no idea what kind of help they were about to receive. The Deathworlders had made their presence known, and the aliens were now at the mercy of the most feared warriors in the galaxy. The once hopeful plea for help had quickly turned into a desperate attempt to understand what kind of fate awaited them. Their last hopes rested in the hands of the Deathworlders, a species they knew little about, but could no longer afford to ignore. The alien leaders, still reeling from the shock of the Deathworlder arrival, gathered once more in their underground chambers. The rumblings of the Deathworlder ships reverberated through the walls, signaling the beginning of a new and terrifying reality. As the council members debated their next move, an eerie silence filled the room. The Deathworlders had not yet made their intentions clear, but their overwhelming presence spoke volumes. The aliens, accustomed to peace and diplomacy, were caught off guard by the sudden, brutal display of force. No one had ever imagined that their SOS call, meant to save their world, would attract the attention of such a terrifying power. Above, the Deathworlder fleet hovered like dark shadows, their ships casting long, ominous shadows over the surface of the planet. The air was thick with tension, and every movement of the fleet seemed to ripple through the atmosphere. The alien leaders exchanged nervous glances, each one silently wondering what kind of help the Deathworlders would offer. They knew they could not afford to make any wrong decisions now. They had no choice but to trust in the mercy of the Deathworlders, even if that mercy was something entirely different from what they had hoped for. In the control room of the flagship, Varric stood before a holographic display, observing the alien world below. His cold eyes scanned the planet's surface, noting the damage and destruction. It was clear the aliens had been overwhelmed by their enemies, but they had also been weak, unprepared for the kind of conflict that the Deathworlders thrived in. Varric's fingers tapped against the control panel as he considered the next steps. His fleet had been dispatched with a singular purpose, either to crush the alien race or to use them for something far more valuable. Varric turned to his second-in-command, a fierce warrior named Kira, "Send down the message. Let them know we are here, but let them fear us," he ordered. Kira nodded, her face set in a determined expression. She had seen the Deathworlders strike fear into countless civilizations, and this would be no different. A transmission was sent, and it crackled through the alien communication system, cutting through the silence that had settled over their planet. The alien leaders listened intently, the voice of the Deathworlder commander echoing in their ears. "We are the Deathworlders. You called for help. You begged for mercy. Now you will listen to us." Varek's voice boomed through the communication channel. "Your enemies are weak, but so are you. We will help you, but remember, we do not do this for free. We help because it serves us. Your survival will be the cost of our assistance." The alien leaders were silent for a moment, processing the words. What they had hoped would be a moment of salvation had turned into something far more ominous. The Deathworlders did not offer help. They offered dominance. There would be no repayment for kindness here, only submission. Back on the ground, the Deathworlders began to deploy their troops. Massive transports descended from the ships, their engines roaring as they touched down on the scared landscape. The alien cities, once gleaming with life, were now reduced to rubble. The Deathworlder soldiers marched out of the transports, their armored bodies reflecting the dim light of the planet's dying sun. They were a terrifying sight to behold, each soldier a towering figure, covered in dark, impenetrable armor, their weapons at the ready. The aliens, still unsure of what to expect, watched from the safety of their underground chambers. They had hoped for an army to defend them, but now they realized they had called upon an unstoppable force. The Deathworlders did not march to defend. They marched to dominate. As the first wave of Deathworlder soldiers entered the ruins of the city, the aliens trembled. The Deathworlders did not hesitate, moving with ruthless precision. They began to clear the rubble, searching for any remnants of the alien enemies that had torn their planet apart. They showed no mercy. Anything that stood in their way was obliterated without question. In a few short hours, the Deathworlders had taken control of the most critical regions of the planet. The alien leaders watched helplessly as the last of their forces were crushed beneath the overwhelming might of the Deathworlders. There was no negotiation, no compromise. The Deathworlders were here for one reason only: to control. The message was clear. The Deathworlders were not interested in saving the aliens. They were not interested in diplomacy. They had come to conquer, to bend the alien species to their will. And though the aliens had called for help, they were now beginning to realize that the kind of help the Deathworlders offered was far worse than the destruction they had faced before. As night fell over the planet, the sky was lit with the flames of battle. The Deathworlders had already begun to reshape the world in their image, and there was no one left to stop them. The alien leaders could only watch in silence as their world crumbled further beneath the boots of the Deathworlders. The hope they had once held so tightly was now shattered, and all they could do was wait for the final moment when the Deathworlders would come to collect their price. The worst part was that they knew there would be no mercy. The air was thick with dust as the Deathworlders continued their relentless sweep of the alien city. Their armored soldiers moved with terrifying precision, leaving nothing behind except destruction. The once hopeful inhabitants, who had sent the SOS, now cowered in the ruins, watching helplessly as their world was overrun. Inside the command center, the alien leaders could only watch the unfolding disaster on their screens. Their people had called for help, believing that some distant force might come to their rescue. But instead, they had summoned an unstoppable storm. The message from the Deathworlders had been clear. Their help would come at a terrible price. Varek, the Deathworlder commander, stood on the bridge of his flagship, gazing down at the alien planet through the large viewing windows. His cold eyes were unreadable, but the satisfaction in his expression was unmistakable. The destruction below was not just a result of war. It was the result of their presence. The aliens had made a fatal mistake when they called for help. Kira, standing by his side, broke the silence. "We've already cleared most of the planet's major cities, Commander. We've secured the key points, but the alien resistance is weakening. They have nowhere to run. Varric gave a slight nod. Good. Let's make sure they understand the consequences of their actions. Let them see the full power of the Deathworlder fleet. The ship's weapon systems hummed to life, ready to unleash devastation. Varric's voice came over the intercom, resonating through the entire fleet. Listen well, alien leaders. You called for our help. You begged for mercy. And now you will witness the true power of the Deathworlders. We do not come to save. We come to control. There will be no more negotiations, no more empty promises. If you wish to survive, you must submit to us. Your future is in our hands. The transmission ended, leaving a haunting silence in its wake. On the surface below, the alien leaders shuddered. What little hope they had was slipping through their fingers, and the reality of their situation was becoming all too clear. They had called for help, believing that the galaxy's merciful forces would come to their aid. But now they understood the true nature of the Deathworlders. These were not rescuers. They were conquerors. In the darkened command center, the leaders exchanged tense glances. They had no choice but to comply. The Deathworlders had already wiped out most of their defenses, and the once mighty alien fleet was no match for the power of their attackers. There was no negotiation left, only submission. Outside, the Deathworlders continued their march through the devastated cities. The ground shook beneath their massive footsteps as they advanced with unyielding strength. The aliens had tried to fight back, but their weapons were ineffective against the Deathworlders' superior technology. Every attempt at resistance had been crushed with brutal efficiency. Some of the alien soldiers tried to regroup, hoping to mount a last-ditch defense, but they were met with an overwhelming counterattack. The Deathworlders deployed their most fearsome units, elite warriors who tore through the alien ranks with ease. They did not fear death. They embraced it. They fought with the rage and fury of a species that had been forged in the most hostile environments of the galaxy. As the battle raged on, the remaining alien leaders held an emergency meeting. They had hoped to find a way to negotiate with the Deathworlders, to turn the tide of the conflict. But it was becoming clear that the Deathworlders had no intention of negotiating. They wanted domination. One of the leaders, a tall alien with gray skin and sharp features, spoke up. We have no choice. We must offer them whatever they want. We cannot afford to anger them further. Another leader, a smaller alien with a nervous disposition, nodded. But what will they ask for? We've already offered everything we can. We've given them our cities, our resources, and yet they demand more. What could they want now? The room fell into a heavy silence as the leaders pondered their fate. They had already given the Deathworlders their planet's most valuable resources. They had surrendered their best cities, their military strength, and even their advanced technologies. And yet it was still not enough. The Deathworlders wanted something more, a price they had yet to name. Suddenly, the ground trembled, and the lights in the command center flickered. The entire building shook as a deafening roar echoed from outside. The alien leaders scrambled to the windows, peering out into the night. Above, a fleet of Deathworlder ships descended from the sky, blotting out the stars. Their massive forms cast a long shadow over the city, making the planet feel small and insignificant. The ships hovered over the planet's surface, their engines glowing brightly as they prepared to unleash their full power. One of the leaders, now visibly trembling, whispered, "This is it. This is the end." The Deathworlders had come, and they had come for everything. The aliens had hoped for salvation, but now they were about to experience the full force of humanity's wrath. The cost of calling for help had been far greater than they could have ever imagined. In the distance, the first bombs fell, followed by a series of explosions that sent shockwaves through the city. The Deathworlders had made their presence known, and there was no escaping the devastation they would bring. As the city burned and the skies filled with smoke, the alien leaders realized the truth. They had not called for help. They had called for their own destruction. And now, The Deathworlders were there to collect their payment. The ground beneath them trembled as the Deathworlders advanced with unstoppable force. The once proud alien cities lay in ruins, reduced to smoldering heaps of ash and metal. The survivors of the planet's population scattered, seeking shelter wherever they could find it. But it was clear there was nowhere left to run. The Deathworlders had arrived, and their wrath was absolute. In the wreckage of the city, a group of alien soldiers huddled together, their eyes wide with terror as they watched the towering figures of the Deathworlders sweep through their defenses. The soldiers had once prided themselves on their strength, but now they were nothing more than helpless victims, watching as their world crumbled. One of the soldiers, a young alien with pale blue skin, turned to his commanding officer. "What do? We can't fight them. They're too strong. We're not prepared for this." The officer, a grizzled veteran with scars across his face, looked out over the destruction. He had fought in countless battles, but nothing had ever prepared him for the sheer power of the Deathworlders. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, ruthless, relentless, and without mercy. "We don't fight them," the officer replied grimly. "We survive. That's all we can do now. We surrender." The young soldier shook his head in disbelief. "Surrender? After everything we've done, we just give up. We can't. We still have some fight left." The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked at the devastation around them. "You don't understand, son. They don't just kill. They'd wipe out everything. We've made a grave mistake by calling for help. And now, we're going to pay the price for it." The alien soldier fell silent, realizing the truth in his commanding officer's words. There was no chance of victory, no hope of rescue. The Deathworlders had already won, and there was nothing left to do but submit to their will. Elsewhere, on the Deathworlder flagship, Commander Varric stood with a look of grim satisfaction as he surveyed the chaos on the planet below. His fleet had already secured the major cities, and the alien resistance was crumbling. The signal that had once been a cry for help was now the final nail in the coffin for the alien species. Varric turned to Kira, his second in command, as the sound of distant explosions filled the air. "They thought they could call for help. They thought we would come as saviors. But we are not here to save them. We are here to dominate." Kira gave a sharp nod, her eyes scanning the data on the control panel. "We've already neutralized their defenses. The remaining leaders have retreated to their underground bunkers. It won't be long before they realize that their efforts are futile." Varric's lips curled into a cold smile. "Good. Let them hide. Let them think they can escape. The longer they resist, the worse it will be for them. We'll make sure they never forget the cost of calling for us." Back on the planet's surface, the surviving alien leaders were forced to face the reality of their situation. They had hoped for a rescue, a way out of the disaster they had unleashed. But all they had received was destruction. In the underground bunker, a group of the planet's top officials huddled around a table, their faces drawn with fear and desperation. The screens around them flickered, showing images of the Deathworlder fleet circling their planet, ready to strike at any moment. They had no way to communicate with their people, no way to fight back. The Deathworlders had left them with no options. "What do we do now?" one of the leaders whispered, his voice shaking. "We've lost everything. Our cities are gone. Our fleet is destroyed. Our people are scattering. We're finished." Another leader, a tall, thin alien with dark green skin, spoke up. "We must offer them anything. If we can just convince them to stop the destruction, maybe we can save what's left." The first leader shook his head. "They don't want our resources. They don't want anything we can offer. They came here to dominate us. There's no negotiating with them." A third leader, a younger alien with bright yellow eyes, stood up and slammed his fist on the table. "We can't just give up. There must be something we can do." But the others fell silent. They all knew the truth. The Deathworlders were too powerful. Their might was too overwhelming. The fate of their world had already been sealed the moment they sent that SOS. In the sky above, the Deathworlder ships continued to hover, casting long shadows over the planet. The battle was over. The destruction had been complete. And now, the aliens would have to face the consequences of their call for help. As the final explosions rocked the surface, the last of the alien resistance crumbled. Their cities lay in ruins, and their military was in shambles. The Deathworlders had claimed victory. For the surviving alien leaders, the question was no longer whether they could fight back. The question was how long they could survive under the Deathworlders' rule. It was a new era now, and the aliens would learn the hard way that calling for help from the wrong people could be the deadliest mistake of all. The aliens' last hope for survival had come and gone in a flash, replaced by the brutal reality of their impending fate. As the Deathworlder ships remained in orbit, casting an eerie shadow over the planet below, the survivors could only watch in horror as their world crumbled. The resistance had failed, their desperate pleas unheard, and their final stand was becoming nothing more than a memory. The once great cities that had stood proudly on the planet's surface were now nothing more than lifeless shells, their streets empty and silent. In the underground bunkers, the alien leaders still tried to make sense of the devastation around them. They huddled together, their faces pale and drawn with the weight of their failure. Their people were dying, their homes were being destroyed, and their hopes had evaporated with each passing moment. "We can't keep running," one of the leaders whispered, his voice trembling. "There's nowhere left to hide." The others nodded, feeling the cold grip of fear tighten around their hearts. There had been so many mistakes, so many miscalculations that had led them to this moment. They had underestimated the Deathworlders, thinking they were just another species they could manipulate. But now they saw the truth. The Deathworlders were not here to negotiate. They weren't here to make deals. They had come to destroy, and nothing could stop them. "We should have known better," muttered another leader, her sharp features twisted with guilt. "The signal was our mistake. We thought we were calling for help, but we've only brought down hell upon us." A young officer in the corner of the room, barely more than a boy, spoke up. "What do we do now? Is there any hope left? Can we still fight back?" The leader's expression hardened. "There's no fighting back anymore. It's over. We must accept our fate." She turned to the others, her voice low but resolute. "We can only try to survive what's left of our world. The Deathworlders don't leave survivors easily, but if we can't fight them, maybe we can hide long enough to wait for the worst of it to pass." But deep inside, they all knew the truth. They were doomed. The Deathworlders were relentless, and their invasion was precise. There was no hope of escaping their grasp. And so, the leaders began to consider their final options. Could they save at least some of their people? Could they surrender in exchange for mercy? But as they looked up at the cold, silent faces of the others, they knew there was no mercy to be found. The Deathworlders didn't negotiate. They didn't make deals. Outside, the skies darkened further, and the sound of distant explosions echoed across the broken planet. The Deathworlders were not just here to conquer. They were here to make an example of those who had dared to call for help. On the Deathworlder flagship, Commander Varric stood, looking out at the carnage below. The planet's defenses had been broken in record time, and the last pockets of alien resistance were all but wiped out. He could feel the heat of victory radiating through the hull of his ship, and yet his expression remained cold. "We've already won," Kara, his second-in-command, said, her voice tinged with satisfaction. "The final blow has been dealt. There's nothing left to resist. They're finished." Varric remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the flames rising from the ruins of the alien cities. They thought they could call for help. They thought they could survive. But now, they've learned the price of their mistake. His gaze hardened. But it's not just about defeating them. It's about sending a message to the entire galaxy. No one messes with the Deathworlders. No one. Kira nodded. Their SOS was their last act of desperation, and it's brought them to their knees. They'll never make that mistake again. With a cold smile, Varric gave the order to initiate the final stages of their occupation. The planet would be theirs, and the alien species that had once believed themselves untouchable would be nothing more than a distant memory. As the final explosions shook the planet's surface, the surviving aliens in the bunkers clung to whatever hope they could find. But deep down, they knew it was only a matter of time before they would be found. The Deathworlders had left no stone unturned. There was no way to escape their wrath. The galaxy would never forget the lesson learned on this planet. The Deathworlders were not to be underestimated. They were not saviors, nor were they negotiators. They were the unstoppable force that had come to claim their place at the top of the food chain. The question was no longer whether the aliens could fight back. The question was how long they could survive in the wake of their own mistakes, and the answer was simple: not long at all. As the last of the resistance crumbled, the Deathworlders' victory was sealed, and the aliens, with their cries for help unanswered, had paid the ultimate price. The aftermath of the Deathworlders' victory left nothing but a haunting silence across the ruined planet. The once thriving alien cities now lay in smoldering ruins, a testament to the overwhelming power of the invaders. The survivors who had managed to escape into the depths of the planet were few, and they knew their time was running out. With every passing moment, the Deathworlders' grip on the planet tightened, and the aliens could only wait for the inevitable. In the dark, hidden bunkers, the survivors gathered in what little remained of their leadership. Despair hung in the air like a heavy fog, but they knew they had one final chance. The Deathworlders had left no survivors before, but they had also left no stone unturned in their conquest. The aliens had underestimated them, and now they had to face the consequences. "We can't hide forever," one of the leaders spoke, his voice strained with desperation. "We must do something, anything, to make them see us as more than just prey." Another leader shook her head, her face drawn and weary. "What more is there to do? We've already failed. The Deathworlders have wiped out entire fleets. What can we possibly do to change this?" The young officer who had spoken before stepped forward, his eyes burning with a flicker of hope. "We still have the last of our weapons. We can launch one final assault. If we take them by surprise, maybe, just maybe, we can force them to reconsider. We can prove we're not as weak as they think." The room fell silent. It was a long shot, an act of pure desperation. But in a moment like this, what other option did they have? One by one, the leaders exchanged glances. They were all aware that this final attempt might not succeed, but what other choice did they have? Surrender was out of the question. If they didn't try now, they would be doomed to extinction. "Prepare the fleet," the first leader finally commanded. "This will be our last stand." The survivors, despite their fear and uncertainty, gathered what strength they had left. They had one last shot to change the course of their fate, and they were not going to go down without fighting. The alien ships that remained were hastily assembled, patched together with whatever resources they could scrounge. The fleet was a shadow of its former self, weakened by the Deathworlders' relentless assault, but it was all they had. As the ships moved into position, a sense of determination washed over the crew. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival. They had to make the Deathworlders feel the sting of their defiance, even if it was only for a fleeting moment. The fleet powered up its weapons, and the last remnants of their civilization prepared to face the impossible. They were about to engage the most powerful force in the galaxy, knowing that the odds were stacked against them. But in the face of certain death, they found a new kind of courage. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about sending a message. The first wave of alien ships launched from the bunkers, their engines roaring to life as they soared toward the Deathworlder ships above. The air crackled with tension as they closed the gap, each ship bristling with weapons, eager for one final confrontation. On the Deathworlder flagship, Commander Varric observed the incoming alien fleet with cold precision. His fingers hovered over the controls, ready to unleash the full might of his forces. He had already won, but the aliens' last-ditch effort was not going to go unnoticed. "They think they still have a chance," Varric muttered, his lips curling into a cold smile. "Let's show them how wrong they are." With a single command, the Deathworlder fleet opened fire, turning the alien ships into fireballs in the blink of an eye. The odds had been overwhelming, and it didn't take long for the survivors to realize they were no match for the sheer power of the Deathworlders. Yet even as their ships exploded around them, the aliens fought with a kind of desperate fury that even the Deathworlders had not expected. Their fleet was torn apart, but each ship carried with it the last vestiges of their pride. The survivors fought to the bitter end, determined not to go down quietly. In the final moments of the battle, as the last of the alien ships disintegrated under the relentless barrage, Commander Varric looked out at the destruction with a sense of grim satisfaction. The battle had been quick and brutal, but the message had been clear. The Deathworlders were the apex predators of the galaxy, and no one could stand against them. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of the battle faded away, Varric stood silently, watching the wreckage of the alien fleet drift into the void. The galaxy had learned a harsh lesson that day. No one was safe from the Deathworlders, not even those who believed they could call for help. For the aliens who had once believed they could survive, their cries for assistance had fallen on deaf ears. The Deathworlders had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again.